Okay. Good evening.
Hello.
Hi, Rob, you can hear me, good. I can hear you too, though. It says you're muted, but maybe you remuted yourself. Yeah. Okay.
Should we just test before we should we test anything before we start, or do you think we should just go straight into it?
What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, why don't you boot up your slides and see if you can share them and control it.
Okay, Rob, can you do that?
I am on it. Okay, the key thing to test, can people see the slides now?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Let's just check to make sure audio comes through as well.
Looks good.
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
Great, okay. Well, it's 7 o'clock, but let's just maybe wait a couple more minutes till make sure everyone's coming, give people a chance to come in. Was there anything else you need to test, Rob or Cameron?
I think that should be it. As long as the
Okay,
audio,
good.
we should be good.
Okay. Might just go back to the main screen for a moment then. Great, okay. So let's see, 27. Hi, Zane. Ryan, do we know, or can you see how many people registered for tonight? Does it tell you that?
We're about, let's see, where are we at now? We're a little over halfway there.
Okay, let's wait a couple more minutes then.
A couple people still coming.
Good.
We could probably get started, I would
Okay,
guess.
all right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's Yellow Audubon Society program meeting. So glad that you could join us. I'm Diane Colborn. I'm filling in for Ann Bryce, who's our president, and also Ken Ely, both of whom could not be here tonight. But I'm a member of the board, and we've got a number of the other board members with us, a lot of members and other community members. So we're glad you're all with us tonight, and we're really excited and pleased that Rob Furrow and Cameron Tesher could be with us tonight to give this presentation. And I want to also thank Ryan for hosting the meeting, and Zane Pickus also for being willing to pitch in and help us with Q&A afterwards through the chat. So just want to remind everyone, if you do have questions during the presentation, if you could, wait until after Rob and Cameron have completed the presentation, then you'll have a chance to, put questions in the chat or use the hand raising option in Zoom. And Cameron and Rob are going to talk about the monitoring research they're doing on nocturnal bird migration using recordings of nocturnal flight calls. And Rob Furrow is assistant teaching professor in wildlife fish and conservation biology at UC Davis. It sounds like he's been birding almost his whole life and brings a lot of enthusiasm to this project. And Cameron is a fourth-year student at UC Davis, also majoring in wildlife fish and conservation biology, and has had a strong interest in bird migration and especially nocturnal migration in the Central Valley. And he planned this project and has been working with the support of Rob on it. So we're really curious to hear about your project and what you've been learning. And I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. We're really happy to be here. I'm really thankful for the YOLO Audubon Society. Now to so basically, as she mentioned, yeah, so we're going to be discussing our project regarding nocturnal flight calls and nocturnal migration, and how we use to monitor them using recorders. So I worked on this with my faculty advisor Rob Furrow. So I know what you might be wondering to start off with. Okay, wait, migration at night? That's a little strange. I mean, for a lot of diurnal birds, because what comes to your mind when you think about this? You might think, oh, birds sing in the morning, and then they'll bathe in your bird bath in the afternoon, and then they'll roost and sleep at night. And that's true on the most part, but during migration, it's a little different. So why don't we play this recording of birds during night? So for those who might be familiar with greater white-fronted geese, that's a flock of them calling. And we actually had those picked up in our recorders in Davis during spring migration. So I think it's important that we talk about nocturnal migration, but to start off, let's talk about migration. So what is migration? Migration refers to the seasonal movement of birds. They would often travel north in the spring and south in the fall for most general species. And a lot of times they'll breed in times of high resource availability, when there's like a lot of food and nesting material and all of that in their northern range, but they would want to avoid those harsh conditions. So here's an example of basically the directional migration they would take. So this is during May 15th to 16th, which is a peak period for a lot of spring migration around the United States. And you can see the arrows kind of pointing in that northward direction for a lot of birds traveling there at 4 a.m. And now since we talked about migration, let's talk about nocturnal migration. So nocturnal migration, as we mentioned, happens generally in the fall and spring. And in fact, billions of diurnal birds, in fact, those are most of the migratory birds, even though they're active in the day, they actually migrate nocturnally. And these include ducks, shorebirds, and most songbirds, in fact, including thrushes, warblers, sparrows, and tanagers, which we're actually going to do talk a little bit about. And here's kind of a cool photo about a whole bunch of birds actually on the East Coast, which is huge for migration, kind of coming into this lighthouse in an island just off the Atlantic Ocean. It's just a sheer number of all of these songbirds, like you see like ovenbird and black-burnian warbler on there. You kind of wish that was in your backyard. Now, since we talked about nocturnal migration, how does this happen? How do birds have the ability to do this? So birds have something called circadian rhythms, which is like similar to our circadian rhythms, but these are actually activated in specific times of year. And this creates the sense of migratory restlessness, or Zugenruch. And these allow these birds to be more active, but also kind of fly in one direction. So at night, they would just depart right after sunset and land somewhere just before sunrise. It could be their breeding location, or a lot of areas, some migratory stopover sites, because their migration routes are very long. And an example of this is actually in the daytime. They'd often find somewhere to feed and rest before continuing their journey. And like it'd often be areas for like water and like food and all that. And I think a perfect example is actually just right in our own backyards, Puda Creek, just by Davis. And and a lot of us have bird here. It has great migratory numbers, especially now. And there's a lot of like vegetation for birds to feed on, and also a lot of water for birds to bathe and drink. And how do they know where they're going somewhere at night? They actually, it's really dark. You might not, they might be completely disoriented and can't see anything, but they actually have specific cues that allowed them to migrate at night. The first one we could talk about is magnetic cues. So birds have an internal compass, which is really cool, and it allows them to orient themselves along through a magnetic field. So basically, they're using the magnetic field, they'll know where north is. And this example is actually used. If you can look at the bottom image to the left, here's a European robin, and they did a study where they actually covered their heads and saw where yet still saw where the birds were flying directionally. And even though they're kind of like a lot of them kind of went a little bit like not in the same direction as everywhere else, most of them were all in a northward direction. So using those magnetic cues, they actually know where north is. The second one is stellar cues, and they actually memorize specific star patterns and to basically orient themselves during migration. They're kind of like nature's little stargazers. And this example we could see on the bottom right photo, and they did a study with an indigo buntings over an observatory screen where they showed a specific star patterns and directionally where they'll end up, and they basically followed a particular pattern for a lot of these birds. And the final one is sunset cues, which is during like twilight and during sunset, it allow these birds to like reorient themselves in knowing where they're going. And again, these are all just a few of the cues. There's still there's a lot of other ways how they could do it, but they might use one or multiple of them. But this is just a general idea of how these birds can migrate at night. And let's just do a quick question. So why do you think these birds migrate at night rather than day? We'll give you about 30 seconds. You can kind of answer what you think in the chat. Okay, calmer air. Predator avoidance, okay. More bugs, fewer predators. Yep, a lot about predators there. Navigation via stars, as we just mentioned. Cooler, better weather. Yeah, those are all great examples that I've been seeing. So a couple of them we actually are already chosen for us. As a lot of people mentioned predation, there's fewer predators. So yeah, birds migrating at day, they're going to be visible. So they often create an approach for a lot of different predators. So they're more at risk during this already stressful time of migration. So an example of this could be is sharp-shinned hawks, which are huge avian predators. And these could be a huge risk for such species. And then also, as someone mentioned, it's super hot during a lot of the times when they're migrating, which creates a very stressful environment because they could lose water and they'll have to spend way more energy than they need. As you look towards the August and September months on this graph, it's around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's really hard for a lot of birds migrating. And for those who are in Davis, days can be a lot hotter during that time than 90 degrees. So they would lose a lot of water, and it would cause them, it's very energetically expensive. So if they migrate at night, they will use less energy, and they would save a lot of water. So now, since we talked about that, what determines specific amount of migration to occur? So a big part is weather conditions. First is cloud cover. So more migration happens on clear nights and clear days. As we mentioned a lot with the star cues, it allows them to be more oriented if it's clear because they can see the stars. But it is true also that call rates do increase with more cloud cover. And we'll discuss about it. I'll discuss about it a little bit because during with more the birds will actually call for reorientation. But we'll go into that a little bit later. Next one is temperature. So during spring they will migrate during warm nights, and during fall they'll migrate during cooler nights. And finally, there's wind. Basically they'll migrate when there's actually a lot lighter wind, because they would be pushed out more with heavy wind, and it'd be harder for them to migrate in a specific way. But also wind direction plays a role. They want the winds to be kind of pushing in the way they're going, just a light amount. So like for example, the wind's pushing north and are heading north for spring, they would want that wind to be in that direction. And now there are challenges though that we have caused with nocturnal migration. And I think one big example is the amount of light that we have. And especially like towards cities, because they do bring birds lower, and especially during times of high overcast. And a lot of this leads to window strikes, which is a huge cause of bird death. And this is one of the reasons of how window strikes occur. And that the lighting would often cause birds to get disoriented and cause them to have collisions with buildings. Because you can see the photo to the left, it's Austin, Texas, which actually is a big stronghold for a lot of migration. And if you and there's a lot of light coming from there. But if you look to your right, this was actually, even though a lot of window strikes is a big thing, especially in the East Coast, it does occur still in the Central Valley. Here's actually a lesser scup that was during their migration timing, and this was seen just hitting dead from a window strike in the morning. So this still does occur. And we did mention a little bit about the lesser scup and migration, and we did talk about the East Coast having a lot of it, but the reason why we want to focus on the Central Valley is that it is a huge migratory hotspot. In fact, in the Central Valley, over 65 million landbirds pass through there in spring. So this is just a great place for a lot of them to be. And unlike the East, where they've already done migratory studies for years and years, there's so much to discover here. And I think just a few examples are from these checklists. The one to the left is from Bart Weekle in Elkhorn Slough during spring. The one to the right is from Holly Cotis, just off of Puda Creek. And you can see the sheer number of migratory numbers, like 62 yellow warblers and 46 Wilson's warblers, and then the other one being 75 yellow warblers and 45 Wilson's warblers and 20 black-throated grays. And this is just in one migratory stop alone. And now, since we understand about migration and at night, how do we track these birds? We do that through flight calls. And because at night, you don't really see them flying through. They're completely dark in our night sky, but we do hear them calling. And these flight calls are often high frequency calls that the birds make while flying. And here's an example with the blue grosbeak. Rob, if you could play that right now. So this is the pick call. This is a call that you hear when they're actually on land. This is not their flight call, but if you compare it to a flight call, so yeah, so that pick call that we first heard, that's basically a lot louder, kind of saying, "Oh, I'm here." But that flight call is like very high pitched. It's kind of like a Z, kind of like a rattle. But they'll have this call, and we'll describe about and why do they have this call? They actually need this call to actually as we mentioned before with like the high overcast and in being disoriented, they'd want to stay in groups with other birds, but also they want to maintain orientation to understand where they're going. So now we discussed about that. Why do we record such calls during nocturnal migration? So one reason is since we can't see the birds, it's going to be too dark to know if they're flying over. So it's impossible to know if there's one above us. But also flight calls are very hard to distinguish by ear alone. We'll kind of go over a few of them, and they often only call once, and even still a lot of their calls are you basically they sound so similar to one another that they're very difficult to identify. So we have to use the visual tools such as spectrograms to see those differences. And finally, even if we all could identify their calls just by one call alone and know, oh, that's a blue grosbeak, for example. They call during night, and like a lot of us, we need our sleep. We don't want to spend 10 hours doing an all-nighter just trying to track the number of bird calls. And I think going to the too dark to identify, like here's like some birds migrating through infrared so you could tell that they're coming over, but you can't really, it's not something that you have to pick up by your own eyes. You're actually using infrared to show that they are migrating through.
Okay, I'll pick it over here. This is Rob speaking now. Thanks, Cameron, for giving us a great introduction to the fundamentals of migration and nocturnal migration in particular. So why do we want to use nocturnal flight calls for research, or how can we do this? This started with Cameron just being really excited about trying to document and measure this migration and figuring out what could we learn from trying to use nocturnal flight calls in this way. And we had a lot of different ideas, but we also didn't know much about what we would find. So it was quite exploratory. One idea was that we could look at sites across a range of locations and think about the timings or relative abundance of birds. And we were also wondering if we might find some species that are pretty secretive on the ground. For example, some of the rarer sparrows, like grasshopper sparrows and vesper sparrows, depicted in the bottom left and right here. We were wondering if maybe we would find some of their flight calls, which are distinctive, to identify these birds passing over that can be really hard to detect, even if they are regularly moving through, just by trying to find them in the daytime, where they're extremely secretive and have very particular habitat preferences. So what did we hope to find? We had a few different hypotheses. So we decided we wanted to look at a range of sites on a west to east gradient. So basically all at the same latitude, north-south, but looking at some sites kind of in the middle of the valley around Davis, and then some sites to the west, including part of the way towards Winters and up into the Coast Range at Quail Ridge and some nearby sites. And we had a few hypotheses here. One was that maybe we'll see just more flight calls in the valley. So we might see some difference in abundance. I say in quotes because we're not directly measuring birds moving, we're measuring their calls. So there's a little bit of extra noise in that process. Two, maybe there'd be some differences in timings. And we hypothesized that we might see earlier migration in the Central Valley where we might expect food sources to occur sooner in the spring, maybe early flowering and earlier insect emergence than we have in the relatively colder and drier Coast Range. And we thought we might see different potential species. So maybe we'd find some particular species that cross the valley but don't really travel along the Coast Range, or vice versa. We weren't really sure there. And because we didn't know quite what we were going to find, we wanted to start by focusing on some species that we know are very abundant migrants that have identifiable nocturnal flight calls. So wherever you see the word NFC, that's our shorthand for nocturnal flight call. So each of these 4 species, which are depicted from left to right, Swainson's thrush, Wilson's warbler, yellow warbler, and lazuli bunting. Each of these 4 species is relatively abundant and a long distance migrant on the West Coast. And they all have flight calls that you can identify both by ear and by looking at a visual of them in a spectrogram. So let me tell you what I mean when I use the word spectrogram. Here, what you'll find, we'll play some of these calls for you, and you'll find that some of them are pretty hard to really get a sense of what they sound like because they're so short. And so what we partly rely on when we identify them is the shape of the call in a spectrogram. So a spectrogram depicted here is basically a free-form version of like musical notation. So we have time on the x-axis from left to right, and then the y-axis is frequency. In other words, this is like pitch. a higher value corresponds to a higher sounding call, and a lower value corresponds to a lower sounding call. So great horned owls are way down here at like 0.5K or 500 hertz. This is a Swainson's thrush. Its call starts around 2 kilohertz and rises up to about 3 kilohertz. And then the spectrogram to the right is a Wilson's warbler. That one is substantially higher. It's kind of in this band from 5.5 to 7.5 kilohertz. So let me play you what they actually sound like. Here's a Swainson's thrush calling, and in the night. So this is a migrating bird overhead, recorded from my roof. So people from the east sometimes say it sounds kind of like a spring peeper, which is a common frog you hear in the springtime in the East Coast. Here is the Wilson's warbler. So very sharp. For people who know the Wilson's warbler's daytime call, it's not identical. This is much shorter, a bit sharper. It might have some features in common, but the nighttime flight calls, even if they are similar to daytime calls, tend to be very short. So if you notice the time scale, what's shown here is from about 2.8 to 3.0 seconds in this recording. So this whole call is less than 100 milliseconds. It's less than 1/10 of 1 second, which should give you a good sense of why you want to record these and not just try to do everything by active live listening. It's really nice to have recordings so that you can come back and visually work through them. Okay, here's our other two species. A yellow warbler has what's called a modulated chip note, where it actually goes up and down very rapidly in pitch. And the quality of that, it tends to produce what we hear in our ears as buzzy. So I'll play for you the yellow warbler. And I'll do it one more time. So very short. And not very much like their daytime perched call. We added a second spectrogram here just to show, interestingly, early in the season, our yellow warbler flight calls tended to be flat. So they would stay at about the same frequency throughout all of the ups and downs. Later in the season, they seemed to rise. So they were modulated, but each peak was higher than the one before it. And we're not sure what that means. We're not sure if that's because we're picking up birds from moving to different areas, so different subspecies of yellow warbler, or if we're picking up differences in age and sex. Kind of an interesting hypothesis that we have to dig in more to try to figure out what might be going on there. Next, I'll play for you lazuli bunting. So at first glance, this might look a lot like the yellow warbler. It's extremely modulated, but you might notice a few things. One, there are more of these peaks. So that's one way people kind of roughly distinguish different kinds of flight calls. If it's a modulated call, you ask how many ups and downs are there? Lazuli buntings might have something like 5 to 10. A yellow warbler will typically only have 3 to 4. And yellow warblers are shorter in the length of their call. And the range from the bottom to the top of modulation is quite small, whereas this spans more than 2 kilohertz, more like 3 kilohertz of frequency, which makes it sound extra buzzy and just a little bit longer as well. So what did we actually do? We mentioned that we wanted to record these. We're putting them at these different sites. We're trying to get this tracking of it. We basically used small automated recorders from a company called Wildlife Acoustics. We used their smallest recorder called the Song Meter Micro. And we just put them in a bucket and then mounted that bucket on a post that we could stick into the ground. Basically anywhere we had ground we could hammer into. Relatively simple. We just covered it with mesh on the top for a little bit of protection. I think most importantly, probably protection from the sun. We used a translucent white mesh that could still allow sound through, but that would at least reflect some of the sun's intensity. And we had one site where we mounted the recorder just directly in the open, mounted to a rooftop antennae. So those are our main setups. And from here, I will pass it over to Cameron to talk a little bit more about how we set up our data collection.
Yeah, so So thank you, Rob. So now we're going to talk about the recorders that we're using. As we mentioned, as Rob mentioned, we're using the song meters, which are the smallest recorders from the Wildlife Acoustics. And the reason why we picked these in particular also is that they're automated. So we can program them to record 30 minutes after sunset and 30 minutes before sunrise, and allow them to just turn on every other day. And these recordings will be saved on an SD card, and the batteries will be replaced regularly, as well as the data from the SD card. And we could help program this using an app on our own phones. And there's a lot of pros and cons with this method, and obviously the pros are huge in why we're choosing it. In that some pros include that they're automatic, as we mentioned before. You don't have to get someone to keep turning it on or turning it off. They program by themselves. Another example is that they're monitored by an app. So it's pretty easy just to see with our own technology if there's any issues that show up. And if there are issues with the recorder, something will pop up on our phones, which is really nice. Also, they're waterproof. There has been a few nights with some rain. So they're protected. The batteries and SD card are completely fine. And also, finally, they are small and portable. So we can easily mount them up. We could easily take them down. We could easily carry it with us from the car and back, or to our field site. And we don't have to worry about that there. But there are some cons. And one issue is battery life depletion. The batteries last only 2 weeks. And if there's for some reason that we can't get all the way up there because we'd have to travel a bit to each site, they would actually die, and we would often lose maybe a night of recordings until we replace the batteries. Another issue is also user error, where it's sometimes hard to know if we turn it on and off, which could easily impact having recordings. And also there's often issues with the SD card where it just won't read if it's taken out a specific way, and you have to take it out by like turning it off and going through a whole process before you could or else it won't be unable to read, and you have to take a while to fix it on your computer. And finally, they are fairly expensive, as recorders are. And now let's talk about just show you a little bit about the recorders. The left, you can kind of see from the left two images what the recorder looks like and how it's set up. And if you look at the left one, you'll see if you can see a little box just below the label with a little circle in the middle, that's the microphone. It's really small, but it's used to help set that up. And if you look to the right image, you could see somewhere where you're able to store the batteries. And you can see that right there. And then there's an on and off switch down there, as well as and then you can see where you put in the SD card. And also these lights will turn on, which are right in the middle. If you could see it, it's kind of small to see if the SD card is working, if it can record, or if it can connect with your phone. And something that's really cool about these recorders is that even though, and depending on how big your screen is, maybe your screen could be big enough where it's actually bigger, the picture of the recorders are actually bigger than the recorders themselves. So, and most of that space is just made up of AAA batteries. And only a small amount of circuits used just for the SD card and turning it on and off, which is really cool. And also, we could just show you a little bit with our app. It may look overly complex, so we'll just kind of briefly go over it. So the left two images is just what the app looks like, and just how we set up. And you can see in the middle one, we set up specific times and all that. And if you look to your right, this is what happens when the SD card's removed improperly, where an issue will show up, and it'll say, if you see in the red text, it says SD card dirty. So so it won't record. So that's something that's really nice about having it on our apps, on our phones, so we know what's going on. And now let's talk about the sites. As Rob mentioned, we have 3 sites we have sites on the Coast Range and sites in the Central Valley. And I'll kind of go from west to east to make it simple. We started from Quail Ridge, which is our furthest west, if you look at the blue pin on the map. And then we went to Stebbins Coldwater Canyon, Audubon Bobcat Ranch. And then moving to the Central Valley, in the middle of it all is Russell Ranch. And then we have 4 households in Davis. And then finally, all the way to the furthest right, slightly east of Davis, is South Fork Preserve. And we would often go out to each of these sites twice a week to for maintenance, such as replacing batteries and gathering information from SD cards. And recorders, we need it, and since it's spring migration's over, we went to each of the sites, we took down the recorders, and we now have a bunch of data. So what do we do about it? So we decided to actually process this through a manual tool called Audacity, as Rob mentioned, because that where the spectrograms are from. And we'll set settings from 1 to 10 kilohertz, which is where the times where a lot of these birds will actually show their flight calls. And basically, as we mentioned, here are focal species. Swainson's thrushes are around 2 to 4 kilohertz. Lazuli, bunting, Wilson's warbler, and yellow warbler around 6 to 8 kilohertz. And we also track each of the calls in a specific spreadsheet. And we also have specific time marks for any other noteworthy bird species that we've caught. So if you look at the spectrogram, you can kind of see here's is a Zonotrichia sparrow that's calling. And you can kind of see that's around like the 7 to 8 kilohertz mark. And it kind of shows you what it looks like. And we'll have another example of what it looks like kind of going through it. And here's a heavy night with Swainson's thrushes. Around mid-May, they might call in this in like this. So so yeah, there's a lot of background noise, but there's also but yeah, at least you know that the birds are actually coming through with those spectrograms. And finally, let's talk about using the automatics, using this instead of an automatic software, because we did try using an automatic software. We used the software called Vesper, which helped track calls automatically, but we found Audacity more useful. And the reason why we found Audacity more useful is that a lot of times, like Vesper would often miss calls during the night. So if in order to have a more accurate amount of calls, and in case we're not missing any other specific calls, we would want to use some manual recorders. And also, Vesper would often find specific calls that might be in a similar kilohertz zone, but they're not actually flight calls. Like, for example, they've called like a northern mockingbird singing a flight call, or they've called even frogs croaking a flight call. So that's definitely something why we use Audacity. But with Audacity, there are costs. It takes a lot of labor looking through multiple nights of recording. So obviously, so when you look at Audacity, it'll take 10 to 15 minutes because you have to go through a whole spectrogram, and which per each hour of recordings. But with Vesper, however, it only takes seconds for it to show up.
Okay, so this is Rob speaking again. I'll jump in from here. And as Cameron just mentioned, we had hoped that an automated method would work well, but just the relative amount of background noise compared to the volume of our calls meant that we couldn't find methods that really worked. So we ended up having to do lots of manual processing, the majority of which was done by Cameron. And what that means is that what we have to present is quite preliminary. It's going to be data from 4 of our sites, and it's data just from a subset of all of the nights. We sampled basically every other set of nights, every other set of our recordings, so that we could get a distribution evenly across our recording period from the start of April to the end of May. But we had to miss some nights, which was frustrating if we knew it was a really big night, but it didn't line up with our scheme for the nights we chose to record and actually process this year. So I'm going to orient you to these data. Here, the 4 sites that we analyzed in this pilot analysis was Quail Ridge, Russell Ranch, Davis, and then one of the Davis sites, and then South Fork Poudre Creek Preserve. So each of these is kind of spanning from left to right, is from west to east among our study sites. And this is a violin plot. It's one way to represent a distribution of how much calling there was in different nights. So basically, what we're summarizing here is at a particular site, so at a particular X value, what proportion of the nights had no calls at all? Those would be the nights that are at 0, versus had an average of 1 call per hour that particular night. To some, here the y-axis is in terms of square roots. So a value of 3 actually corresponds to getting 9 calls per hour or 16 calls per hour in this Davis site, and so on. And so what you can see here is that the Quail Ridge site had a lot of quiet nights, which is not something we were totally sure would happen, but the majority of the nights had between, well, half the nights, this is the median, this horizontal line in the middle. That means that half of the nights had a call rate below that line, and the vast majority of the nights had less than 1 call per hour at Quail Ridge. At Russell Ranch, it was closer to, this averages out to like 2.5 calls per night, closer to a median of almost 4 calls per night and around 1 call per night in South Fork Puda. So what we don't see is sort of a clear increase. What we actually see is that the Davis site had the most big nights, the most nights with more frequent calling. It has the highest number of nights that are at this upper end. And this is for all the calls of any songbird. So that included our 4 focal species, as well as other songbirds that we left in the other category, that some of which we could identify, some of which are ambiguous, like the flight calls of a Townsend's warbler, hermit warbler, Audubon's yellow-rumped warbler, and a few others. And so this is all of the calls of songbirds, all of these very short nocturnal flight calls. You can break it down by our focal species too, and this is a little bit of an overwhelming table, so I'm just going to summarize briefly. One thing you may notice is that these are the average hourly rates at each of the sites for each of our species. So these numbers don't exactly correspond to the square of these because these are medians on the left. These are means. But what you'll see is that in general, Swainson's thrushes tend to be the most abundant calls. And in fact, Quail Ridge had almost no calls from any of the warblers or lazuli bunting. But it did have really basically one night with a good chunk of Swainson's thrushes that led to this higher average. And then the total also incorporates other calls. So it incorporates all these categories added together, plus the rate of other flight calls of songbirds. Russell Ranch actually had substantially more of the warblers, like Wilson's warbler and yellow warbler. In Davis, we had the highest overall total average call rates, particularly of Swainson's thrushes. We had a couple really big nights. So a couple nights where we might have had 500 birds in a single night. And then South Fork Puda Creek, again, had a lot of Swainson's thrushes. Interestingly, had very few Wilson's warblers, but a decent number of yellow warblers. So in terms of timing, with our current data set, there's enough variation with big nights and then nights of no birds moving that you really can't do much to evaluate peak timing with this data set. We're hoping as we expand it to a few more sites and fill in some of the gaps, instead of using just a subset of the nights, that we'll get a better sense of this timing. But what we found is that Swainson's thrush calls just had a couple really big nights. So one where the hourly call rate was around 10 birds per hour. That was really because there was 1 hour where there were quite a lot of calls compared to the other hours. And then a variety of kind of moderately busy nights at each of our sites. Here, Quail Ridge is in green, Russell Ranch is in orange, and the South Fork Puda Creek is in purple. The reason why we don't have the Davis site on these is because that one had a recorder issue around May 16th to 18th. So we lost the last week and a half of data, which means that it wasn't really useful for looking at timing patterns across the whole season. Wilson's warblers had more of a clear peak, and particularly at Russell Ranch, which was one of the most abundant sites for Wilson's warbler. And we had our biggest nights around May 15th and a little after, and then almost none by the end of May and the start of June. For yellow warblers, we also had a little bit of a more clear pattern, where we had, interestingly, slightly different peaks at different sites. Russell Ranch peaking a little earlier, South Fork Poudre Creek peaking a little later, although I would assume this is more just driven by the random chance of exactly where the biggest nights happen to be for, because these patterns are really driven by a few clusters of birds moving. You often just pick up a couple big groups here or there in a big night. So we're not really getting the kind of data to tease apart the timing of migration along this west to east gradient. And then finally, lazuli buntings, you may notice a slightly different x-axis. I didn't include April 1st through 15th and the others because there were no calls of any of those species, and even no calls for a while after April 15th. Here, the bird calls started a little earlier and actually immediately peaked. So some of the highest calls were right away from late April into early May, and we still got some birds around May 15th, and then a really sharp drop off, and basically never had a lazuli bunting again after the, whatever it is, I think 17th of May. So Cameron mentioned earlier, why it's useful to record these as opposed to you just trying to sit outside and listen. I do encourage you to try to go sit outside and listen for songbirds. It's really fun. And we have a little information to tell you when you might want to do it. So unfortunately, the best time to do it is not after you have a nice dinner and you've got a glass of wine and you can go sit out in the evening and listen to the birds fly over. Very few birds are calling right in the hour after sunset. Swainson's thrushes are the most extreme example. Let me orient you to this plot. So in this plot, we're reading it kind of like a 24-hour clock, where the top of the plot is midnight, the rightmost side is 6 a.m., the leftmost side is 6 p.m. This is all daytime on the bottom, so we're ignoring it, and back around. So it's a circle because time is circular in this way. And what you can see is that we're seeing the relative call rate at different times of night. And basically, we didn't start to pick up any Swainson's thrush calls until around midnight, and it progressively got more intense. So as we got to the last 2 hours before dawn, we pick up almost all of our Swainson's thrush calls. So maybe that night you have to go to sleep a little early, and then you can wake up more in the morning early with a nice big pot of coffee or a mug of tea and get out there at 4 a.m. if you really want to hear the Swainson's thrushes. The pattern is not quite so stark for the other species, and I wouldn't get caught up too much. This is a pretty strong pattern for Swainson's thrushes. It's unclear if the relative ups and downs here are anything more than just the chance of our particular sites and nights we looked at. But nothing is really calling super early in the evening. Things often pick up. In general, they felt like they would pick up around midnight, and that was the case for yellow warblers and lazuli buntings. When we look at the actual raw data, we did get quite a few Wilson's warblers even earlier than midnight in our data, but kind of relatively compressed to the middle 5 hours of the night around midnight, maybe with a slightly more overall number of calls a bit past midnight. And then finally, we had been wondering about secretive species, things like sparrows. But what we also discovered is that a lot of water birds are moving that we can detect in our flight calls. So one example is the western willet. So willet is shorebird, and they winter on the coast of California and other parts of the western United States, but they don't breed there. They travel inland and they cross the mountains and they breed in the interior west. So these birds have to cross in pretty large numbers from the coast to reach their breeding sites. But they're very rare to find them on the ground in marshes in places like Yolo County. We might find a couple every year. So what exactly are they, what route are they taking? And how can we measure their abundance as they move through? It turns out these birds are pretty vocal in flight. So even with our pretty small pilot data set that we had a chance to analyze so far, We did find multiple flocks of willets passing over. And here's where we saw some pretty clear differences between the Coast Range site and the sites as we get closer to the valley. So at Quail Ridge, we had essentially no water birds calling in any of our recordings, except 2 nights where we did have Western or Clark's grebes, April 21st and May 10th. And that night we also had an unidentified shorebird call. Interestingly, Western or Clark's grebe happens to be birds that would forage on and potentially breed on a water body like Lake Berryessa or other reservoirs in places further north on the Coast Range. As we move inland to Russell Ranch, the town of Davis or South Fork Buda Creek, we start to see a broader diversity and a greater number of times we encountered flight calls of water birds. Like at Russell Ranch, we had a widgeon, least sandpiper. On April 29th, we had Western sandpiper and a willet, probably a couple willets. It wasn't a really big, loud flock, but it was enough calling. It was likely more than one bird. And interestingly, kind of late on May 11th, we had a common gallinule call, and we had some shorebirds calling as late as May 18th. In Davis, we had lots of geese. So we had many nights with greater white-fronted geese, which I'm going to abbreviate as GWFG from now on. And we had multiple willet flocks on one particular night. On the night after sunset of April 13th, we had several flocks of willets move through. We also had dunlin, and we had 2 species from the Rallidae family, 2 rails. We had Sora on April 24th and common gallinule on April 30th. And then on South Fork Buda Creek, we actually had both Sora and Virginia rail, and some other interesting unidentified call. Early on, we had something that sounded like either a rail or a crane. And towards the end of the season, we had something that was an identified bird that was somewhat shorebirdy and somewhat rail-like that we still haven't figured out. So we encountered lots of questions as we worked through this process and are still very much kind of working through the data. So what do we want to do next? Well, Cameron is going to graduate and go on to new jobs and other future exciting things. But through his boundless enthusiasm, we have data from 8 sites in both a spring season and a fall season. It adds up to 1,000 gigabytes of data and many hundreds of hours. So hopefully we'll figure out some ways to use some automated tools or just work with a bigger group. So I'm working with a larger group of undergraduates who are going to start taking on more of these sites and dates to continue this analysis and work into the fall. Because we only talked about the spring data here, but we also have data from the fall season, which might have quite different patterns, both in terms of relative abundance and which species you find where. In addition, we have lots of calls that are labeled as other. And partly that's because of our learning process, and partly that's because there's still a lot to learn about Western songbird migration nocturnally. So there are some where there's just very few good documented flight calls of some of the species. And so one project that I'm doing with a group of students now is to try to get more flight calls that are validated. So flight calls where we actually have a bird that we can see flying over, visually identify it, and record it with a directional microphone. And we focused this quarter on the Blue Ridge Mountains, so like the Blue Ridge on Blue Ridge Road and Mixed Canyon Road, west of Vacaville, with the goal of hopefully documenting lots of flight calls of different warblers and maybe some other species as well, and trying to start rounding out a good database of Western birds to allow some automated methods to work better in the future as well. So with that, there's a lot of people we'd like to thank. We had helpful funding from the UC Davis Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology Department. The Yolo Audubon Society sponsored Cameron for part of this work. The Swift family, which has a fund through the WFCB department at UC Davis. And then we got lots of helpful support or access to sites to place our recorders from Andy Inglis and the Museum of Wildlife and Fish Biology, as well as hosts like Robin Kulikow, Michael Perrone, Bob Meese, Dash Weidhofer, Jean-Philippe Marie, Andrew Folks, Shane Waddell, Paul Haveman, John McNerney, and Christopher Gardner. So took many people to get this project going and many hours of Cameron changing batteries and slowly working through these recordings. So thanks everyone for joining. And now we're happy to take any questions y'all have.
Well, thanks, Rob and Cameron, so much. That's just fascinating. And it's good to know, even though Cameron's is not having to, but is fortunately having opportunities he's moving on to, that you still have some students and that might be interested in continuing their work on this, because it doesn't sound like there's a lot of other people maybe that are doing this kind of research. So it's really great. So do we have any questions people could put in the chat or hands raised? Zane, can you help me with that, identifying people?
Yeah, for sure. It looks like John McNerney has his hand up if he wants to go ahead.
Yeah, hey guys, nice work. First of all, Cameron, well done. And hopefully the next steps of your career here are gonna be bountiful. I can't wait to see what happens. And then this is a question, Rob, nice job too for helping him steer into this direction. I think it's fascinating. It certainly is, there's a lot to unpack and certainly a lot more room to explore using this technology. I guess my first question is, do you guys have an understanding of what the sample area is for each one of these recorders? I noticed you have them in a bucket and they're pointing up into the sky, but do you know how far out is it actually capturing birds?
Cameron, do you want to answer? I'm happy to give it a shot.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can repeat that really quickly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I noticed the way that you have your apparatus set up, it's in like a bucket, right?
Mhm.
And it's pointed up to the sky. Do you guys happen to know the sample area? So what portion of the sky above that recording device, how far is it looking or hearing, as it would be?
I'm not generally sure. They actually do have a great amount that they do pick up. I'm not sure the exact amount that they can, but because since they're not really directional, but they kind of like go from all around. They do pick up a great amount, and we have tested them in how far they pick up because they have picking stuff up that are way far beyond. Rob, if you have a better answer, I'm afraid I can't answer an exact amount.
Yeah, the answer I'd say is that I also don't know. It'd be fun to try to quantify it. I think you could quantify it with some kind of like noises of known amplitude at different distances away, and try to figure out what you could really pick up that would be readable on a spectrogram. And I suspect, we're not picking up much if you think about a giant net across the sky and we're catching things in a little net passing through one part of the sky, we might only be catching something that's a little cone that's maybe 500 feet at its widest and going up about 500 feet above us or something like that. You can get more directional and pick up things that are higher, maybe lose a little bit of the width of your cone. We had kind of a relatively short and wide cone with these omnidirectional microphones.
If there's any other questions, I'll defer. I got one more.
Looks like we've had some in the chat.
Okay.
The first question I see in the chat is actually something I was going to ask too. If the Davis calls, or the fact that there's more calls over Davis, could that have to do with there being extra light in an urban area and maybe that attracting more migratory birds?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Actually, that is one reason why we think that actually Davis could have more calls than somewhere like Russell Ranch or South Fork Preserve. And that they'd often be more oriented going down with the light. And that's something that's also really interesting that we noticed. A shout out to my mom who asked that. Rob, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's the key. I think that's why really the most helpful comparisons between the Coast Range are actually the other dark sites. The other sites that are of a similar quiet and darkness, which are Russell Ranch and South Fork Poudre Creek. And the Davis sites, they're kind of fun because they're just more active. So you get a better sense of all the things that are there, but they're not great for direct comparison because the conditions are very different and birds call more in lighter areas and they call more in louder areas. So actually, counterintuitively, you don't want to go to the most remote, quiet, beautiful place to find flight calls. You want to go sit like under a light in the McDonald's parking lot and like eat a cheeseburger.
The next question I see is asking about if there's any software that you can run through to analyze your recordings. I think you touched on that a little bit, but this is maybe more specific.
Yeah. So obviously we talked about using Vesper. I think we did try using Raven, but because we want to try every single call and notice it look for specific species in general, and in case they don't get caught through automatic, which they haven't caught when we tried running it through. We think that using it manually is the best method, but maybe there will be a better automated system that could catch through everything and won't filter and won't have anything that we have to filter out because they are not actual flight calls.
There's a few students trying to explore it, trying to do some extra processing of the recordings ahead of time, because if you can filter out some of the background noise at kind of non-target frequencies, then suddenly the calls do become the loudest thing you have left, which might allow the software to work better. It does work better with more expensive recording setups where the bird calls are loud compared to the background noise. But with our kind of more affordable to be able to do at the scale of 8 sites and with a small number of batteries, we had to deal with this really loud background noise, basically.
This next question is a little bit longer, but it talks about the new Modus antenna that CDFW has put out in a lot of places. And if you guys are familiar with that and maybe want to compare and contrast it to your audio monitoring. I don't know which one of you guys wants to take that to start.
I actually am not familiar with it, but Rob, if you're at all familiar with it,
I'm sort of only vaguely. So yeah, I guess there's that, which is really detecting individuals, in my understanding. And then there's the really coarse scale, which is radar-based detecting broad kind of clouds of the movement of birds. I use cloud here, but I mean a dense cluster of birds in a cloud-like fashion. And I think they're all useful in different ways. The one benefit of flight calls, among others, is that they're species specific, or they can be. And so you can get a sense not just of the magnitude of all movement, but I don't know how well Modus can do that, figuring out things at that level, right? I don't know enough about it to know. Maybe it can do some things that would be really cool.
The next question asks how you identified the calls to species given that they're different from daytime calls.
So the flight calls they give at day are basically the same flight calls they give at night. But the only and we mentioned when we mentioned the blue grosbeak example, the example we gave are more the calls when they're landed rather than the calls they give at flight. Like for example, you might hear a lazulite bunting fly at day, and it'll give that kind of buzzy like zit call that we heard on the recorders, and that's also similarly to the and that's similarly to what we hear at night of these flight calls. Hopefully, does this answer your question? Rob, do you want to touch on anything?
I think that was good, Cam. Let's see.
Well, this is Michael Perone.
Okay.
No, that doesn't answer the question. I don't understand how you go from a daytime yellow warbler to a nighttime yellow warbler and know that it's a yellow warbler. Those calls sounded different enough to me that I could not have identified them as that species, with the exception of the Wilson's warbler. I have once in a great while heard the Wilson's warbler in the daytime give that nighttime call, but it's like about one call out of 50 or 100. And the other 3, those calls were totally unfamiliar to me. I mean, maybe my hearing is impaired a bit at high pitches, and that's the problem. But I'm asking you, how did you identify them? I mean, where'd you start with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing also to realize is that we did have to heavily like move up the pitch a bit. I think like I noticed like the lazuli bunting sounded a little bit off. I think it's maybe like a little bit with Zoom, a little bit with because I know like when we were practicing, like it sounded a bit better. But I think that I think when you see a more natural recording, it'll sound very similar to what you might hear at day. Just because I think with the Zoom audio, since it sounds a little bit enhanced, yeah, it'll probably sound different to your ear directly. But yeah, we could probably play. If you are like interested, we could probably show you through like email or something. Rob, or you want to add anything or?
Oh, I was just going to say, there are specific conditions when you can get the nocturnal flight calls. Well, you're right. There's a missing step of validation generally, which is that we don't actually see the birds at night giving the calls. And so there's always a step of assumption that goes on with flight call research, unless there's people who have like amazing, some kind of nocturnal thermal camera setups, and they can really identify the species and get the flight call at the same time at night. But the places where you do encounter them, for example, with yellow warbler or with yellow warblers or yellow rump warblers, which I hear their flight calls a lot, is in the early morning when you have the birds come down at first light, or if you have birds doing some morning flight. So in Davis, sometimes I park myself at the edge of farmland next to a stand of trees, and I catch the birds like coming into land and find a patch where they can forage. And those birds often still do give it the flight calls, which is sort of the impetus of taking students out this spring. And Zane is one of the students coming out on the ridge this spring to try to do some recording of these birds in the early morning as they're continuing their migration, when they're maybe most likely to continue to give some of these flight calls. Granted, there might be that they are generally a little longer in the daytime than the flight calls they give at the night. But still, for some of them, there's almost no documented, like McGillivray's warblers, there's just very few. For some reason, Cornell says they have one, but they haven't posted a good one publicly that I've seen. And I'm hoping that we can document some of those and get some sense of the variation in those calls as well within a species.
Okay, thanks.
The next question that I see is, since you were talking about how a lot of the species you got recordings after midnight or around midnight, do you think that the 4 target species start flying after midnight, or do you think they're just migrating all night but not vocal until it gets later?
So we mentioned that even though you may say like I think what we did focus with those 3 of the 4 target species, basically lazuli, bunting, yellow warbler, and Wilson's warbler, not as much as the Swainson's thrush. They actually, I mean, they'll, as we mentioned, they fly directly right after sunset, but then they'll call kind of throughout the day, but throughout the night. But with Swainson's thrush, so I mean they'll kind of just call throughout. So we'll probably they're probably, but they are all migrating all night basically, as we mentioned, because they'll leave right at sunset, arrive right at sunrise. But I think there are reasons why they might be calling less. Maybe more of like basically on how high they are, it might not be detected. They might not be calling as much because of weather conditions. And with like obviously Swainson's thrushes, they call way, but we had more calls during the end of the night rather than the beginning of the night. But we still had some calls at the beginning of the night. So I mean, it still is possible. Rob, do you want me to answer anything or clarify anything?
Cool, thanks, Cam. And the last one that I see in the chat, I think John said he had one more question after this, was that how do you separate a higher rate of calling at a site versus a higher rate of birds at a site? Can you correlate your call data with other data sources such as Doppler radar or eBird, like Birdcast or others? How do you account for the number of birds passing over a site?
Rob, you want yeah, I think you answered, but Rob, do you want to answer this one?
Sure. Yeah, so we that's one of the things that we kind of recognize, that this is one of the reasons why nocturnal flight call monitoring is not like a huge field of research. It's because there's a layer in between the birds and what you can detect. And that layer is bird behavior. It's how much they're calling, which is shaped by all these different conditions. And there's no good way to be sure. You can kind of model it. And so that was one of the reasons why the study we thought had to be comparative, because we can't really learn something directly from one site about how many truly yellow warblers there are passing over. We had to think about it only in terms of relative numbers in sites where we could match their conditions in as many ways as possible. And that's obviously not perfect because some conditions are going to be different when we go west to east. The weather's not going to be identical. The winds are not going to be identical. But we tried to make sure we had sites that both had some good matching conditions, but in different areas with different potential flyways. And then some sites with a variety of different conditions, like different light and noise backgrounds. But we have the data of radar estimates of birds in flight for all of our nights. We haven't done an analysis with it yet, but we could do, the simplest one is to look at the general correlation between how many birds are estimated to have been in flight that night and the rate of calls we're getting, to get a sense of how consistent they are and how well correlated they are. And hopefully they're pretty well correlated. If they're not correlated at all, then we have to ask some questions about what these bird calls are telling us, because it's certainly not telling us something about abundance of birds in the air then, in that case. And there was one question, before we get to Camille, there was one question in the chat that was just to me a little earlier. And that was asking, kind of similar, have we compared our audio results to other methods like radar to see whether vocalizations are a reliable method? So yeah, the question is it at least something that is kind of on average pretty consistent so that it's a useful proxy or not? And that's something we need to work with. There's some evidence from other papers that is the case, that there's a general moderate correlation between the bird calls you detect and the magnitude of migration as estimated by radar.
I think Camille has her hand raised, and then I think John is next.
Hi, I want to ask a more general question about how research like this could be used, and I think it's really cool. So it's no criticism. I'm just trying to understand. I don't know how prevalent the data is and how widespread. I mean, do we have all of California over a period of time? Because it struck me that it would be perhaps interesting or useful, but you tell me, you guys are the experts, to track changes in migration. And I mean, the obvious one living in Sacramento for me is the wild turkeys that suddenly are wandering around all over that didn't used to be. And another one that is the Anna's hummingbirds that have expanded their range up into British Columbia. So I'm just wondering if you could use data like this to track that sort of a trend, not just the numbers of birds that are moving and certain target species, but the changes to the direction that they're going and the number of them that are going different ways, if that makes sense. Perhaps I'm overestimating what is possible with the technology.
Oh no, that's still a great question. I think I'll have Rob answer that because I feel like it seems like a different project.
I can say that, that was one of the things that came up with Cameron and I in the very beginning, is like, wouldn't it be cool to have data over many years? Because then you have a natural comparison at the same site through time. This is a pretty narrow instrument in the sense that it only works with the species that call frequently enough to pick them up and that we can identify. And so that kind of narrows down the number of species you could actually measure it with. But you could imagine getting some really interesting information about population size changing and even estimating maybe what parts of populations are decreasing based on what parts of the migration period we see these declines in calls. But it's going to be messy. So you're going to want a lot of sites and a lot of years to get a good pattern there. And you're going to have to make sure that conditions aren't also changing, like warmer nights or things like that might influence the results. So you need a good model of the way environmental impacts work as well.
John, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so actually my question was mostly answered earlier on. It was in regards to the Davis, City of Davis sample location. At each one of those sites, I'm trying to remember your the map you put up there where your sites were. Were there just one recording device per site, with the exception of Davis, right? Which had like 4 that you guys pooled your data together for?
Yes, we had one recorder per site.
Okay, so even in the City of Davis, or was there multiple?
So to City of
recorders?
Davis, we had different properties that we inputted one recorder there,
Okay,
but they're
you
all
only
kind of
did-
surrounded around different areas of Davis.
but you only have one recorder going each night within the city?
Yeah.
Copy that. All right, thank you. Nice
Yeah,
work.
and also, yeah, thank you for helping clarify that, Rosemary. Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a cool example. I like I think I've heard the water drop call. I've never heard, and I think it's just super cool of it being called a whistle call. I think that's really neat with the swing sits rushes. I've definitely noticed that.
Well, I think that's about it as far as questions that I'm seeing. Diane, do you want to help wrap it up?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again, Rob and Cameron, so much, and appreciate everybody's questions. And it's just really fascinating research, and we'll be interested to see where it goes from here, and the other projects, the extensions of the project you'll be working with other students in the future. I just want to thank everybody for coming and remind folks that our next program meeting will be on May 17th, and that will be, our presenter will be John Sterling, who will be showing a slideshow of some of his trips. And we've also got a number of field trips coming up, which will be in early May, late April. Look for those to be posted on the website and the Facebook soon. And again, just thanks everyone for coming, and unless anybody has any other announcements, we'll close, and thanks again. Okay, all right. Thanks so much. All right, have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.